Hello, everybody. Chess Audio Books here. We're looking at round 12 from the Tata Steel Vikenze tournament between. All right, this game started out Eljanov playing d4, e6 from Magnus, and that lets me know that he's got something up his sleeve here. So c4 from Eljanov. Note that he could have played e4 with the possible transition into the French defense. For instance, e4, d5. But usually, if you play d4, c4, you want to try to keep it in the area, keep the opening in the realm that you're familiar with. So he plays c4, and of course, there's some transpositional possibilities here. For instance, knight f6 could be played, d5, etc. Magnus chose to play f5, the classical Dutch variation. And going into the Dutch in this manner uh, was popular back in the days of Botvinnik and Bronstein in their World Championship match in 1951, which I believe was the last World Championship match to heavily feature the Dutch defense. Both players were playing this opening, and they were playing it from d4 e6. If I remember correctly, I don't think any player opened with d4 and a direct f5. They played e6 first, and then the game either went into a French defense or a Dutch. And the reason why e6 is chosen first is because um, black can avoid some annoying anti-Dutch variations by playing e6 first. Oftentimes, if a player plays f5 first, there's all kind of annoyances like bishop g5 that have to be considered and analyzed. E4, Staunton Gambit, even moves like queen d3, g4, and you get the point. The list goes on and on. Even h3 followed by g4, knight c3 right away. And not that any of those variations spell the end of the Dutch defense, but it's just a lot of preparation added on, especially when you don't really play the opening that often or you're just trotting it out as a surprise weapon. So e6 is often a safer alternative to avoid those secondary moves. And again, the only thing that you have to be prepared for is to play the French defense if your opponent switches to e4. But I find that most of the times, if the opponent plays d4, he wants to stay in, the queen's pawn opening realm, and he won't just switch over to e4. But sometimes it happens. So c4 was played by Elyanov, f5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, and we see ourselves going into a classical Dutch defense. However, Carlsen plays the famous Stonewall defense. If he played d6 here, then we will be in the classical variation, and play can continue. Knight f3, bishop e7, castle, castle. Say knight c3 for example, and sometimes you get these kind of lines. Ilyan Janeski variation, and this bishop will find its way out of the pawn chain. And one of black's main ideas is to eventually squeeze in e5, and also combined with an attack on the king side. This is the main idea of the Dutch in general. Let's get back to the game where Carlsen um, played the Stonewall defense, and the Stonewall uh, is aptly named because it is difficult uh, for white to just break through in the center due to the setup that black employs here. As you can see, those pawns on that constellation of pawns, rather, from f5 to e6 to d5 and c6, make it very difficult, especially the pawns on d5 and f5, make it very difficult for white to obtain the desired e4 advance. So it will take white some time and preparation to be able to advance in the center. Thus, the Stonewall it's very difficult to break through. At least that was the reputation. And of course, over time, many different ways, you know, um, came about as how white should approach the Stonewall and dealing with it. And there are many different approaches. Um, but let it suffice to say that black's basic plan, or plans rather, are all right. So again, it's not going to be in too much detail because I mean that could be like a whole video series talking about the Stonewall. But just know this: there's basically two main Dutch, excuse me, two main Dutch lines. One is the Stonewall, which we have on the board. The other is the Leningrad setup. I'll just give you a quick example of that. This would be your Leningrad variation. Okay, and it was named after masters in Leningrad that decided that the bishop could be more effective on g7 than on e7 or d6. And the Leningrad variation of the Dutch is a close cousin to the King's Indian defense. King's Indian defense, black gets e5 in first and then later on strives to get in f5, whereas in the Leningrad Dutch, look at the basic plans again in the Stonewall here, or in the Dutch in general, excuse me. Okay, first from white's perspective. Of course, white wants to get e4 in uh, after d4, so black counters this with f5. Okay, so one of white's main plans is to play for the central push e4. 2. Another plan that white often employs is to advance on the queen side. He might play moves c5, b4, a4, etc., advancing on the king side. Another plan by white is he might attack on the king side himself, playing moves like g4 at some point, h4, h5, especially against Leningrad setups where the black pawn is on g6. Okay. Um, Now, moving on to the other side, and of course these plans can be combined. Sometimes a player will play on the queen side and in the center at the same time. So there's all kind of flexibility here, and different setups reflecting the different kind of plans. Okay, so that's just a brief summary of what white, different plans and approaches white can have toward playing against this. Okay, so what is black trying to do? Let me get to the main position there. There's the Stonewall. What is black trying to do? One of his plans is to orchestrate the move e5. We see this pawn is backward, and a lot of times if he can get that move e5 in, he can obtain a good position with pressure coming down the e file. Notice that with the c4 pawn there, however, puts a lot of pressure on the black Stonewall structure. So e5 is not always easy to obtain, because then you can wind up with a real bad pawn structure if you play for e5 too prematurely. Another plan in the Stonewall for black is to work on getting the advance c5. These are more modern plans. The classical plan for black and the plan that most people are familiar with is to attack on the king side. Everybody loves to attack the king. And you get, you know, the idea of castling king side, knight e4, king over to h8, you get g5, or sometimes this rook will come up here to f6, to h6, etc. Everybody loves the king side attack. That's the most famous plan in the Dutch. But of course, as white came up with antidotes to various plans, black had to come up with other plans. Another plan for black is for himself to attack on the queen side with moves like a6 and b5 and c5, etc. Okay? Another plan for black is, notice this condition of this bishop is pretty bad. All right, 6 out of the 8 black pawns are all on light squares. So this bishop is doomed if this situation is not rectified. So often you'll see a plan after castling where this bishop will come to d7, e8, and then end up on h5. It's a timely maneuver, but it gets the bishop out into play at least. This is known as a Botvinnik maneuver or variation. Another less time-consuming method of developing this bishop is to simply play b6 and then put the bishop on b7, although the bishop often doesn't have as much scope until later on in the game. Okay, so those are the basic plans of white and black in the Stonewall defense setup. Okay, so with that said, let's continue on with the game. At this point, Eljanov played bishop f4. Now you see that he's allowing black to compromise his pawn structure after the exchange. Bishop takes f4, g takes f4. But have no fear, this is all common stuff. And usually what white does, remember I said one of white's plans is to attack on the king side himself. And normally what white does is, with obtaining this square for his knight, okay, he practically shuts down e5 for the rest of the game, and he obtains this open g file, which he'll use to attack on the king side. That's the normal plan that's set up. Normal setup, a normal plan that goes with this setup. Another thing too is I didn't mention that it is a strategic plus for white to exchange off the dark square bishop. Why? Because again, look at black's pawns. 6 out of the 8 pawns are on light squares. This makes his dark square bishop his best bishop, his good bishop. All right, and so it's usually strategically a strategic plus for white to trade off the dark square bishops. And you'll see that not only in this variation, but in other variations. For instance, sometimes, let me just go back. Sometimes you'll see things like this. For instance, let's just make up a couple of moves. Say b3, c6, and you'll see ideas like this to trade off this this bishop. Of course, it's not possible here because, and hope my astute tacticians realize that, because a bishop takes, knight takes, and then queen a5 check. But I just wanted to give you an illustration that a lot of times in the Stonewall or in the Dutch period, Leningrad or Stonewall, the dark square bishop is of utmost importance. Sometimes white will sacrifice a rook to obtain the dark square bishop, especially in the Leningrad variation. Moving on. So knight c3, c6, and now we have g takes f4. Castles, e3, bishop d7, and we see Magnus Carlsen right? Trying to rectify the situation with this bad light square bishop. He lost his good bishop, the dark square bishop, so now he's trying to make that bad bishop into a good one. Notice how Magnus doesn't play the move d takes c4, which would be strategically faulty, right? Against the Stonewall. Now he doesn't have a Stonewall anymore, right? Now he has a backward pawn here. Um, and after knight e5, uh, white just has a good position, right? He can't really hold on to that pawn because of the pressure that develops here. And then we see this rook here unprotected, and a move like knight takes b5 refutes the whole concept. So he keeps the Stonewall intact as he should. Queen b3, exploiting the absence of the bishop on c8. Queen c7. Queen b6 is possible, but usually black tries to avoid the inferior ending that he usually gets into as a result of trading queens too early. Okay, queen c7. And Eljanov castles. Now again, to me, this is a crossing of plans right here. You have the open G file here. Okay, you allow these double pawns, you have the open G file. It makes sense to put the rook here right away. And perhaps castle queen side. For example, let's let black continue with this plan, bishop e8. Let's play knight g5 to attack this e6 pawn. Bishop f7. Okay, relegating the bishop to some more passivity. And then castle. Knight bd7 and king b1. I like this position for white. Okay, it's logical, and it goes along with the requirements of the position. Now Eljanov played castle. Now at some point he might decide to tuck his king over in h1 and then move his rook to g1. But it seems a little bit slower to me to do it like that. So castles, bishop e8, and now he plays rook fc1. So now he's not even using the g file. So to me, it seems like he's mixing up plans a little bit. Now he's playing on the queen side. Okay, so he has the g file open. He's playing on the queen side. Now what he has done is he has stopped e5 from happening. Queen e7, and Eljanov plays queen a3, which I believe is a little bit hasty right here. Again, white normally wants to try to get into an endgame, but having those pawns on a2 and a3 like that, I'm not too happy. I'm not too happy about that. Yes, he gets the open b file, but now he has double pawns on the a file and f file. All right, so I think he's overestimated his position a little too much. Okay, there's no need to rush to trade the queens off. I like the simple move, knight in the e5. And notice that knight bd7 is not immediately possible because of the pressure here. You would just take this pawn with the attack on this rook. That's like a logical move to me. I didn't like queen a3. So queen takes, b takes a3. Now knight bd7, rook a b1, and he easily parries the threat there. A4, a5. This is interesting right here, knight b6, right? Looking for the threat. And if c5, and the knight to c4 is nice, comfortable place for the knight. And notice how there's no pawns adjacent to the c file that can drive the knight away. However, instead of c5, perhaps trying to open up things a little bit might work out better for white. All right, going back. So Carlsen played a5, fixing the uh, pawn on the light square, a4. Rook b2, with the obvious idea of doubling up, perhaps. Knight e4. This kind of slows black, slows white up a little bit. He can't play rook cb1 because the knight will be hanging. So he plays knight takes e4. This gives black a tempo though. So d takes e4, and now knight g5, and white gets it right back because this pawn has to be defended. Oh, excuse me. So rook f6. And now is a good time to play rook cb1. And now this is looking pretty good for white. This is just kind of justifying white's play and allowing his pawns to be doubled on the a file, because there's really no way to satisfactorily defend this pawn here. For example, after h6, knight h3, and then what? If you try a move like b6, then just more pressure gets put on. Of course, this rook is vulnerable. And let's say after bishop h5, and just c takes b6. Rook b7, initiating a blockade. And then the idea basically is to bring this rook back in here and then try to retrieve the pawn. But this costs some time, and that time that black is trying to retrieve that pawn, white can improve his position in other ways. So rook c1, rook fb8. And then you could have this mass trade of pieces. Okay, and then after rook c8 check, king h7, black is not too bad. Okay, then he can start, his king is nice and safe here, and then these pawns on a4 and a2 start looking a little suspect. Okay, so Pavel Eljanov avoids that straightforward continuation, even though I think it's a good move because obviously improvements can be found in that sample variation. I like rook cb1. He played f3, which I also like. Okay, tearing down a Stonewall. So again, we could take time and reflect on what I said at the beginning about how sometimes plans can be integrated and mixed with each other. So we saw this idea opening up the king side. Then we saw Elyanov attacking the queen side, and now we see him attacking in the center. So it doesn't always have to be a just one-dimensional plan, but it can be a mixture of plans. It's just important to understand what you're doing. h6, knight h3, Carlsen takes, e takes, bishop takes, rook drops back, knight f2, and that knight is on his way to d3 and e5, because that's one thing in the Stonewall is that e5 square is always a big problem. Okay, here I'm really liking white's position here. It's hard for black to really generate any meaningful play at this point. Magnus plays c5. Of course, we're going to ignore that because we don't want to capture and give Magnus the just free access to c5 with this knight. That would be a no-no. So knight d3, attacking the pawn, threatening to win the pawn. C takes d4, E takes d4. So now, at this point, white has a clear plus. Okay, he's obtained his objective. He's torn down the stone wall. The stone wall is no more. And black is left with a backward e pawn, which is what happens after the stone wall has been torn down and e4 has been obtained successfully by white. So white has obtained e4. He has the b7 pawn, which is tremendously weak and attacked by two pieces. The bishop on f3, rook on b2. The e6 pawn is backward. The bishop on e8 is horrible. Rook on f7 is horrible. And the knight on d7 is looking for somewhere to go. So let's see what happened. White has a clear advantage here. So you won't want to repeat this as black, the way that Magnus played it, regardless of the outcome. Okay, you do not want to be in this position if you had the black pieces. But if you had the white pieces, you want to be in this position. So Magnus plays knight f6. Where else to go but g4 or e4? Knight c5. Again, just piling up on b7 and hitting that e6 square again. Magnus jumps in to e4. So now it's sacrifice time. Right? He just gives up the pawn. Knight takes e6. If knight takes e4, this is good for black because after f takes, bishop takes, he gains the tempo here, and then this pawn is also up for grabs. And he has to be careful trying moves like that. Rook g4, for instance. And let's just say for argument's sake he went there. It's a tactical blunder. Can you see why? Rook takes. Check. And black will be winning just like that. So although white has a good advantage, he has to be careful. So knight takes e6 is played. Now you got a clear pass pawn on the d file. Magnus picks up the straight pawn on a4. And another good thing for Magnus is that he's finally gotten this bishop, this bad bishop released. Eljanov comes up with a nice move, and it's a pretty obvious move. Is he pushes the pawn to d5, not only advancing the passed pawn, the old saying passed pawns must be pushed, but what he does is he secures the knight on e6. All right, so Magnus played bishop d7. Right, obvious reaction. Keeping an eye on that knight on e6. I mean, that piece has to go. Now here, Eljanov plays bishop takes e4. And I don't like the move because now after he gets rid of that powerful knight right on e4, and it's annoying. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that he feels that way. But the problem is now the pawn on f4 becomes easier to attack. The only defender is the knight on e6, which can easily be snapped off. I can see his idea because he's looking at it like, hey, this knight on e4 is, part of the blockade system of keeping these pawns going forward. So he figures he'll just snap that off, and the pawns will have an easier time of running up the board. Rook e1 with the idea of taking the knight, and then after pawn takes, rook takes seems d takes e6. Rook e7. Now you take. You see, and now this looks great. This looks grand. This looks grand. And now really the only move that black has to stay alive really is g6. Why g6? Because you have to stop this pawn from linking up with the other pawn. If you don't play g6, then f5 will come into the picture. As you could keep this pawn isolated by g6. So that's kind of like the only, like white's last gasp, so to speak. Then after that, you could play moves like rook b5 or fix the pawn first, like I always talk about, right? Fix the target, and then say king g7, then play rook b5. So now that pawn, that a pawn can't move. Okay, so it's still a game, but I like white here. So let's say that Eljanov rushed it a little bit. So he plays bishop takes e4, f takes e4, and now he plays knight c5. Okay, so bishop g4 is played. Of course, not rook takes because then the knight gets captured. Excuse me, not the knight, the bishop gets captured on d7 if this blunder is made. So the bishop has to skate out. Bishop gets to g4. And now we see this move, rook e1. Now, knight takes e4 could have been played right away. That would have been meant by rook takes f4, attacking the knight. So Pavel is trying to shut down on the counterplay, and he plays rook e1. And Magnus plays rook c8. Rook takes rook takes e4. Rook takes f4 could have been played here. I don't see a good reason not to play it, and perhaps might have been a better move than rook c8, because I don't see really what what the big deal is by delaying that move. Say rook takes e4, for instance, and then rook bf8. Okay, and I think black is still a little worse here, but I think this is a good good continuation for him. Instead, he played rook c8. So now we had knight takes e4, rook takes f4, and now the knight goes to d6. And Magnus plays rook cf8. And so Magnus starts getting a bit active. Okay, so it's kind of like he's found some he's gotten his bishop. He's kind of solved his problems that he had earlier in the game. That bishop, which was bad, is now looking pretty dangerous as White's king is unprotected out in the open. All right, and now White seems to be having a little bit of difficulties uh, with his C and D pawns moving. Remember what I always say about pawns that get demobilized. They become liabilities and targets. The pawns always have to be able to move. So, rook b3 is played. Again, not knight takes b7 because of what? Now rook takes c4. Of course, rook takes c4 is playable, but there's stronger continuation. Simply bishop h3. The idea is to checkmate white on f1. There's no stopping that without giving up the exchange here. So the only way to stop that would be basically to give up the exchange by playing rook g2, which is kind of like suicide after bishop takes, king takes, and then rook takes c4. So that's the threat. Okay, so rook cf8 is played, and just to show you that, if rook takes b7, again, same thing. How do you stop the rook f1 threat? There's no way to stop it. This rook is up here now. Before it was here and could at least sacrifice itself. Now it's up here. There's nothing that can be done. So, all right. So seemingly out of nowhere, Magnus has whipped up some mean counterplay here. So rook b3 is played. Rook 8 f6. So he simply attacks the knight. Knight e4. Again, if knight takes b7, then just simply rook takes c4. Knight e4. He moves the rook to g6. And this looks pretty nasty. I mean, there's some threats here. Discovery against the nude king there. So rook g3 is played, and a wonderful move by Magnus. I love blockades. I love blockades because that's part of the soul of chess. Like Philidor said, pawns are the soul of chess, and we can see this once, um, you know, this pawn configuration that once looked so mighty and promising, right? We thought this pawn was just gonna race up to d8 and become a queen. All of a sudden, there's trouble, and these pawns are being hindered. They're not completely fixed yet. This one is pretty fixed. This one is, they're being hindered. That's the first process, is to hinder or slow down, then completely fix, then destroy. And we see that process taking place. D6. Like I said, the pawns are not completely fixed yet, but they're hindered. So the partner is left behind. It's like the two soldiers. One of them gets wounded, and the guy's like, "Man, I don't want to leave you, man." And the guy's like, "Go without me." So that's what happened here. Here's the wounded soldier right here, and this pawn is saying, "Man, I don't want to leave you." He's like, "Go, do it for your country." So this pawn goes to d6 all by himself. Magnus plays a fantastic move, king h7, knight f2, and now what is he gonna do? Look at these pawns. These pawns are all alone right now, and his partner just gets captured. His partner just gets picked off. Right? Isn't that a sad ending to the career of that pawn on c4? So instead of knight f2, white doesn't really have a lot of options with that rook. If rook g2, for instance, then black can turn the tables real hard with bishop f5, which is a nice move. Double attack on the knight and attacking the rook at the same time. So this is practically forced. And you have the same fate for that pawn. So I find it interesting because I felt that white had a clear advantage uh, earlier in the game, and somehow Magnus just outplayed his opponent. Outplayed his opponent, made a couple of moves that maybe weren't necessary, and that's all it took for Magnus to get into the driver's seat. And now you see him up in material now, and now that D pawn looks very shaky. Eljanov trades off, and that pawn is in deep trouble. So rook e6, king g8, and that of course the king is just gonna walk over now. Rook d1, d7, okay, and this is basically sacrificing this pawn for this pawn, D pawn for B pawn, excuse me, which Magnus will happily take. And now we have a 2-to-1 pawn advantage on the king side. So one of those pawns, probably the G pawn, is going to be the candidate. So rook b2, king back into safety, king e4, rook h5, putting pressure on the h pawn and defending his interest on a5 at the same time. Rook h4 check, king g3, g5, rook b7, king is marching forward, rook b6, king h8, king h5, h3, now rook a4, rook c6, and now here Carlsen could have just took the pawn right away, but he decides to drive the king back and take the pawn with check. So that's what he does. King g3. Now a4 is the candidate. Rook a6, a3, and needless to say, black is totally winning now. Rook b2, king g3, and of course, this is not really a big issue here. The rook takes a3. We see an analogous position as happened in the game. You would simply just have king h4. Notice the threat against the h3 pawn. There's really no good way to defend that. Okay, so if rook a4, for instance, then the pawn would just, the pawn would just capture. Excuse me, the king would just capture. And if rook a6, the pawn would just move forward. And we'll see that in a few moves. So rook b2, king g3, a2 from Magnus, king f3, and now he just sacrifices the pawn. So it's basically the same idea, right? He sacrifices the pawn and then just plays king h4. And Pavel Eljanov resigned. And it's for the same reason. There's really no way to stop king takes h3 or black from winning that pawn. If he tried to move like rook h1 or something like that, then simply rook b3 check followed by grabbing the pawn, and there's no way to stop black from queening a pawn. So very interesting game. You don't see the Stonewall too much. Interesting play by Eljanov, and it's like he collapsed somewhere in the middle game. And I felt that was interesting because, Magnus' position to me seemed on the brink of disaster. I did not like this move by Eljanov, but it seemed like after this, he still somehow made it work. And it seemed like he outplayed Magnus here. And again, instead of that a5 move, I recommended knight b6 being an improvement. Because I felt that a5 kind of caused some of his problems and exacerbated the weakness in the position. A lot of dark square weakness from black. And here I felt Eljanov was basically near the height, basically the heights of his positional superiority at this point. After 24 knight d3, c takes d4, e takes d4. I thought the game was almost over. By move 40, that 45 moves that Magnus would be, resigning. I saw so much weakness in this position for black. Again, I don't recommend you repeat this because Magnus pulled a rabbit out of the hat today. And he's a fighter. He's a Lasker. He's another Lasker. I tell you, he fights. He plays a lot of psychological games. He might not play theoretically correct openings and do a lot of computer preparation, but he fights in these positions. And it paid off today. And Yeah, Elyanov was definitely doing his thing here. I mean, again, full driver's seat, but I felt he made that mistake, and I don't know if it's enough for the game to completely turn around. But Bishop takes E4 is definitely a mistake. Just Rook E1, just continue to excuse me, just continue to build up on the position. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Comments are appreciated. Please like and subscribe to my channel. I do the best that I can, and I hope that a lot of people are commenting and sending me encouraging messages, and hope that I can relay my understanding. I'm not a grandmaster, but I have been playing for a very long time, you know, and I like to think that I understand the game, you know, and like I said, I hope my lessons are thorough. And if you have any questions, just feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. All right, guys, thank you very much. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you down the road.